Coronavirus cases continue to explode all over the world, and it's official. It's a pandemic. Not according to the WHO, but according to Brazil and everybody with a brain between their ears. Hello, everyone. This is Chris Martinson. I'm here with your SARS-CoV-II update for March 3rd, 2020. I can't bring myself to use the WHO's COVID-19 moniker. Not because there's anything particularly wrong with it, but because the WHO came up with it. And they are just so far down on my crap list at this point in time. I just can't bring myself to do anything that would maybe put a good light on them at this point. They need change. All right. If we look at the numbers here really quick, I don't believe these China numbers at all. Again, I think they're directionally correct. We're going to talk about that in just a second. South Korea, now over 5,000 cases. We are starting to see this serious number creep up. Not that much compared to that, so it could be that they're just doing the super bang-up job of testing, and they're catching a lot of sort of low symptomatic people, maybe even asymptomatic people that either have not yet or will never progress over to the serious critical stage. So I think that's explaining part of it right there. Still a very high number of active cases, so you can see very few have resolved themselves here. So perhaps this number grows. Iran, I'm going to show you that I think these numbers are crud as well. And of course, this is completely unbelievable. Nothing there. Italy, now over 2,000 cases. So we're seeing this really continue to grow. And the Diamond Princess now actually, remember that was stuck at 704 for a while. We got a couple new cases sort of snuck out around that. Japan still climbing up. France didn't really update on here. I know they've got a bunch of new cases in there. Germany as well. So we can update these. But this is the 100 club now. Everybody on this list is 100 or higher. So let's take a peek at some of these new cases in the United States. Of the 4 new cases, we had the first new case in New Hampshire, another case in Illinois, I believe, another one in Oregon, and that new case from the cruise ship. Get to that, what that means in just a second. Gibraltar, first case. Ukraine, first case. Argentina, first case. Really worried about Argentina in this case because, of course, it's just about to move into their fall and into their winter. So if this moves south of the equator, this bears watching very, very closely. Now, 5 new infections in Belgium. And I just wanted to point out something around this, which was it says here, it concerns 2 Flemish people, 2 residents of Wallonia, and a resident of Brussels who've recently been abroad. 13 people are now infected in the country and necessary care in the safe environment. Very little data around this. Necessary care in a safe environment. Where would that be exactly? Which hospitals? Where are they located? That would be really critical information, particularly if you notice we've had a bunch of outbreaks from places where so-called quarantining was supposed to happen and from hospitals and things like that, because if you're not running the absolute top-notch program of containment within your hospital setting or your quarantine setting, this thing is escaping. It is the honey badger of viruses. It's just an escape artist. It's the Houdini. It's just amazing. So I think this is out of an abundance of caution of trying not to alarm people, but I think people deserve to know where that safe environment actually is if they're living next door to it. I would want to know that, of course. And China's National Health Commission reported 11 new cases of coronavirus outside the Hubei province. That's just 11. And of those, 7 were imported from Italy, they say. My goodness. So I guess what that means is Italy's now a bigger source of this than China. I don't believe it for a second, but we'll get to that in just a minute. Remember, the disease progression here is case, cluster, boom. Right? At first, it starts out really slow, but that's because this is an exponential function, and then they go like that. And of course, we are linear creatures, so we're really meant to understand things that go up like this. So this other one, not so much. So at any rate, just keep that in mind as we go forward here. I want to show a couple other things to you. First, this was really interesting to me. Came out March 2nd. Today's March 3rd. The Texas mayor in San Antonio declared an emergency in a bid to keep cruise passengers in quarantine. Maybe he read something that said, hey, 14 days isn't enough. And I would agree completely with Mayor Ron Nierenberg around that. So he declared a health emergency in a bid to force those in a federal coronavirus quarantine at a nearby Air Force base to remain locked down until more testing is done, or maybe a few more days pass. I think that's a great idea. His decision came after a woman was released from quarantine by federal officials on Saturday, only to test positive for coronavirus after she was free. So we talked about that case yesterday. So here are local officials, and we're seeing this at the local hospital setting, at the county health board level, and here at the mayoral level for a city. They're just saying, we're not on the same page with you over there at the federal level. The federal people have been doing some really unacceptable things that just, you can't, there's no good way to put this except to say, they're inadequate. That would be the best I could say. Inadequate. All right. Iran is officially reporting 835 new cases and 11 new deaths for a total of 77 deaths and that many cases there. This is absolutely can't be true. And I'll tell you why. This circulated a lot. Yesterday was seeing, there's this video, and I just took a still from it, but I watched the video, and you can if you want, but this is in a single morgue in this Iranian city of Qom, and you see here 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and there's 9 bags right there. As this person filmed around in this one morgue, went through 3 separate rooms. I counted over 50 body bags in a single room. They're saying 11 new deaths. What I know about this culture is that you're going to be burying these bodies within 24 hours. No cremation. They're going to get buried. So to see over 50 of these body bags in a single morgue tells me that this 11 new deaths can't possibly be right, and 77 can't possibly be right. And it gets worse. You know, we know that Iran got hit really, really hard. I think this is where, when we say how does R naught, how does that actually manifest? That's the transmissivity of a virus. It's not an intrinsic number that's a factor just of the virus. Sure, the virus helps. It's got it's either very infective or not, but then the rest is up to your culture. Are you going to effectively socially isolate? Are people going to be aware of how to cough, behind a surgical mask? Are people going to have just basic hygiene awareness and all of that? Iran seems to be behind the case on that. I've seen all these videos of people defiantly saying their God will protect them, and they're licking surfaces to show that they have complete faith and all of that. So that's just not working out, and it's exploded through Iran. And right now, as of today, we found out that 1 in 10 Iranian MPs have tested positive for the coronavirus out of 290. I think it's 23 or something like that now. Just crazy high transmissivity. So this thing is not only ripped through Iran, but ripped through and ripping through the very top of its political structure. All right. So as well, I want to point out something here in new cases. This is very troubling, I think, because it sort of picks up and builds on what the WHO has done, which is seemingly being more concerned about stigmatizing people, upsetting them, hurting feelings, than tending to what we would call public health. So the number of coronavirus infections in the Netherlands has risen to 24 reports, RIVM, I guess their equivalent of the CDC. 6 new patients on Tuesday, all of whom are in home isolation. So that's not always a good thing, I don't think, necessarily. All of the people diagnosed with the virus have recently been to northern Italy. So Italy is just this super spreader, I don't know what's going on with that particular virus up there, but it seems to be jumping very easily. RIVM will no longer announce where patients come from or where they stay. That's no longer is going to tell anybody in the general public where patients come from or where they're staying. And that's essential information. I like how South Korea is doing this. You got to tell people precisely where are the infections, who's been contacted, all that stuff, and that gives private citizens the opportunity to react and adjust. So if you told me right now that there's a case that we just found and they were at the movie theater downtown, I'm not going to go there. But, RIVM is solving for some other thing besides what I consider to be the core tenet of public safety, which is people need to be armed with the best possible information. That's what we're doing here, arming you with the best information we can. I disagree with this very strongly, no longer telling where patients come from or where they're staying, because this thing has jumped out of quarantine more places than I can count right now. It really has. And so when we consider, this is the same text from prior page, look at how the World Health Organization is approaching this. They say, when talking about SARS-CoV-II, certain words and language may have a negative meaning for people and fuel stigmatizing attitudes. Here they are, they're worrying about feelings more than they're worrying about getting the health aspects of this right. I just couldn't disagree with this anymore. I just couldn't. These words and language can perpetuate negative stereotypes or assumptions, strengthen false associations, and other factors create widespread fear or dehumanize those who have the disease. I'm not so sure about that. I think that it's when you have a disease, it's pretty important to know who's got it and all of that, because that's how does social distancing and isolation work if you don't know from whom you want to socially isolate or distance. It looks to me like we've got a PC culture run amok. I think that when I said R naught is a function of the virus times whatever culture you've got going, the PC culture is going to turn out to be a not dominant, not strategic, not very solid way to go about this, because it's just data. If the facts hurt you, the problem isn't with the facts. These are facts we need right here. And which is who's got it, where are they, and how do I avoid that? As this person replied in response to this tweet over here, the virus doesn't care about feelings, doesn't care about stigma. All it cares about is a willing host and complacency. I agree, Doug Jones. You got that one right. So as we go a little bit further, here's a consequence, I think, of, no longer announcing where they come from and worrying about how people are, feelings are going to play into this. How about this? So this again, in the Netherlands here, Red Cross Hospital announced a temporary admission stop for the intensive care unit on Monday evening. A patient who was admitted there on the 20th of February was later tested positive for the new coronavirus in an initial test. A second test still needs to be performed. Patient currently is in isolation. This is the third hospital that temporarily can't accept new patients because of the virus, at least in intensive care. So what's happening here is that an already thinly resourced and stretched hospital system is now finding whole parts of them shut down. This is absolutely not what needs to happen. And of course, this happens best in an environment of secrecy and a lack of transparency. So if you're not going to say where they're coming from or all that other stuff, don't be too surprised when they get admitted to a hospital and then, oops, now we have to shut the whole thing down to decontaminate it. And that's not even remotely what we want to see happening in this particular case. So let me agitate again one more time for transparency. Transparency. We need all the data. Just give it to us. We can manage it, and our feelings won't be hurt. Don't worry about it. All right. Southeast Asia, still a mystery. In Time magazine, they're talking about a silent epidemic, ? Experts fear the coronavirus is spreading undetected in Southeast Asia. Of course, something I've been concerned, and I'm still have an open question mark about Thailand. But it's kind of weird here in this one region, a steady facade of optimism persists, and that Southeast Asia's foreign ministers have all joined hands with China and declared their intention to stay strong. Yet hastily called meeting in secretive socialist Laos last week suggests not so much resiliency as the need to shore up mutual support. Health experts are widely skeptical of the numbers reported by China's neighbors and believe the deadly infection is spreading undetected throughout much of Southeast Asia. Strangely absent from the list, so when we go up to these big lists up here, strangely absent from this particular list would be places like Myanmar, Laos, which border China, as well as Brunei, East Timor, Indonesia. So you would think that these places would actually have cases, but since they've reported none, as far as I know, then that's the concern here. So I share that concern. All right, moving on. China's numbers, just simply not believable to me, and I'll tell you why. So 2 days in a row, the lowest number of new cases in China. It all sounds very good, right? The number of new coronavirus infections in China appears to be declining. Maybe they are declining, but I'm going to show you I don't think they've gone to zero, and I'll show you the regional data in a second. 125 new cases of corona infection reported in 24 hours, the lowest recorded in 24 hours since the 20th of January. So on the surface, good news, but only if we can trust it. On Sunday, the day before, there was also a record low of just over 200 cases, so falling, 200, 125. The WHO, for its part, came out today and said, on the falling number of cases in China, we questioned those numbers while we were in China. We scrutinized this data, and we believe that this decline is real. Wish I could trust you on that, WHO. I really do, but trust got a little bit broken here in this process so far. Meanwhile, so China just, I guess, locked a few people in their homes and, they got their hands around it. But watching South Korea really struggle with it, seeing here's South Korean President Moon puts all government agencies on 24-hour emergency alert, says country at war with coronavirus, right? They have all these cases, way more than China. China's got way more population, and it's where this thing started. Somehow China got their arms around it and stopped the whole thing, right? And that's really confirmed when, this is the official data coming out of China. These in blue, these are the new cases out of Hubei, and here we see them just falling. New cases elsewhere in mainland China. Look at this. Hit 0 right here around the 18th of February, and it's been at 0, except for one little blip right there, a couple cases, but it's basically been at 0 for closing in on 2 weeks now. So if the cases have been nearly 0 for 2 whole weeks in China, you'd think that they would, outside of Hubei, that they'd be getting back to business, right? But when we look at the average road congestion across 100 cities in China, by the way, these are great charts from Capital Economics. Forgot to point it out. There's the capitaleconomics.com, and there's the rest of the URL that gets you to all of the next charts I'm about to show you. Good stuff. Really enjoying these. Average road congestion across 100 cities in China. Here we have 2017, 18, 19, and then 2020 here is this line right here. Yes, it's ticked up of late. I see that uptick, but this is running at about half the road congestion compared to all those prior years. There's always a big dip right around the Chinese New Year, but then this never really got back there. So this is roughly half the road congestion. So when you say there's half the road congestion, you're saying basically there's half the economic activity, roughly speaking, in an area. And when we look at passenger traffic, this is down a stunning 75% still compared to where it is. So on the right-hand scale over here, right-hand scale, we see the percent year over year. So what's the percent year over year? This is 0, minus 20, minus 40, minus 60. Let's call this minus 70 right in between those two. So it's a little bit, that's a nice job drawing a flat line there, Chris. About minus 75% or so. And looking at the daily trips, they just fell off of this cliff and really basically never recovered. So what we're seeing here is this passenger traffic is way, way down. I just read a report that they're offering quote-unquote cabbage prices on the airfare just to get anybody flying again. That would be like $13 to fly pretty much, somewhere in China to somewhere else in China because the traffic is just cratered. So again, I'm just wondering if we're really sitting here at a place where there's just no new cases. Why is it that we have basically no road congestion, no air traffic and other, rail traffic and things like that? And as well, when we look at coal consumption, so the power plants are going to be burning more and more and more when your industrial processes and fabrications come back online. So there's a base amount of coal consumption that happens just because people live at home and they have lights on. But the rest of this is the industrial part dying off during the Chinese New Year and then coming back online. So this was last year right here. This is about a 45% decline still in power production and consumption. So this means factories have not started up again yet. And again, why not? If there's no cases, why is that the case? And then as well, we can look at here the mean tropospheric nitric oxide density. So you're going to, when you burn things, you're going to create these nitric oxides. That's, it comes out of smokestacks and tailpipes and things like that. And you see here Hong Kong way down here, and this is really the heart of the northern industrial area. And Wuhan was already offline by January 1 to 20th. This is when these averages came out. And on this side, we're looking at February 10th to 25th. Just to put this in perspective, this is South Korea here. You can see Seoul still, making some nitric oxide there. But this is North Korea right here. Look at the amount of nitric oxides being created around there. Whole chunks of China basically have the same output right now industrially as North Korea. It's just not a good sign. So there's just a huge, huge fall off in industrial activity in China. And that tells us, I like actions more than words. The words are, hey, we have no new cases. The actions are quite different from those words, which just says everything's still at a standstill there, despite the happy words that say this infection is gone and moved on. All right, so at this morning early, I was up early this morning pulling stuff like this, and this is now past tense because we're going to talk about what the Fed just did in a second. World finance officials are considering how to cushion economies against coronavirus. So when they say world finance officials, they're really kind of talking about central bankers, and they're just saying, hey, what can we do to bolster economies against the impact of spreading coronavirus? That's what they want to know. But they're not expected to specifically call for new spending or coordinated interest rates cuts. So they're still just at the talking stage here. This is a tug of war between hope and fear. Central banks are giving hopes with their potential stimulus. Hopes of what? When they do this stimulus, all that's really happened in the last 10 years is they've shoved financial asset prices higher and higher. But for people who are working for wages, for middle-class families, all of this hope is really just for the 1%. It's for the people who have direct large exposure to financial assets. Because when they do this kind of thing, when they give this stimulus, well, corporations use that stimulus to borrow money really cheaply. And then what do they do with that? Well, they buy back their own shares and things like that. Yes, Vasu Menon, it's wonderful that they're given hopes with this potential stimulus. But the question is really, what can they do? What would a lower rate of interest do, really, in a world that's already awash with just ridiculous amounts of liquidity? The easiest financial conditions were registered recently in basically all of history. I mean, that's just astonishing. And banks have been printing, central banks, printing. So the question is what will they do? Monetary policy is already very loose and interest rates are already very low. I agree with that, Vasu. I'm with you on that. So all these G7 officials have thought to do, what are they going to do? They said they're going to pledge to work together to mitigate the damage to their economies from the fast-spreading epidemic. But the question is, what will more money printing really actually do? So it was kind of expected. Today, the Fed came out with an emergency rate cut of 0.5%. And I wrote about that. I said, great, the Fed's panicking. So sarcastic question, how much lower will rates need to go before you book that trip to Disneyland? Another 0.5%, maybe 0.75%? Just being sarcastic here, because to me, this idea that, the Fed has a hammer and everything's a nail, like, oh, we'll just lower interest rates and somehow that's going to be the thing that really helps. I would also point out here, got an email from Jeff, you'll know who you are here. The last emergency Fed cuts, they cut 50 basis points in March 2001, and of course that was marking the popping of the tech bubble right then. They also had an emergency 50 basis point cut in August of 2007, which preceded the subprime crisis. In January 2008, they had a stock crash that created an emergency cut of 75 basis points. And then in October of 2008, very famously, the Lehman 50 basis point emergency cut. So these emergency cuts are meant to telegraph we're on it, we're doing something, but sometimes the market reads that as more of a sign of panic and as that something bad is coming, not that the Fed just did something good. Hey, I'm recording this, it's 2:00 right now, so and I pulled this off it as of 1:28, but here's what happened. It was pretty dramatic. Here's where the Fed announces its emergency interest rate cut, and it went up about, that's 25, 50, 75. So it went up about 75 points on the S&P. That's a huge amount. And then it lost it all and then some. So I think what's being happened here is the same as we saw at other emergency rate cuts. The rate cut is now being viewed as a sign of that there's an emergency, and it's not a good sign. It's a bad sign. Okay, supply chain disasters still continuing to mount. This is the Apple edition. Hey, Wall Street Journal finally got on the supply chain disruptions. Yes, been waiting for this because it's really important, of course. Long before the coronavirus struck, Apple's operations team began raising concerns about the technology giant's dependency on China. Yeah, whoever those operations team were, apparently they were not listened to and overridden by other management. Some operations executives suggested as early as 2015 that the company relocate assembly of at least one product to Vietnam. One. That would allow Apple to begin the multi-year process of training workers and creating a new cluster of component providers outside the world's most populous nation. People familiar with the discussion said, senior managers rebuffed the idea. For Apple, weaning itself off China, its second largest consumer market and the place where most of its products are assembled, has been too challenging to undertake. So this is like, hey, if something's not broke, don't fix it. But they put all their chips in one place. This is really going to be quite damaging. Really is, because, again, there's not a lot happening right now around Wuhan right here. This is where a lot of Foxconn plants are around here, and there's a few here, and there's a few here, and there's some here. So they're all sort of stretched up right through here. Okay, not a lot of manufacturing happening there. And so for Apple, that's kind of a big deal. Here's the big part. So this is just so complicated and complex. And I really think this next couple of sentences captures this really well. A clean break with China is impossible. Apple relies on a workforce of more than 3 million indirect workers in China. 3 million. Oh my God, that's huge. Its top manufacturer, Taiwan's Foxconn Technology Group, hires hundreds of thousands of seasonal employees in China, many of whom manually insert tiny screws and thin printed circuit boards during the iPhone assembly process. People familiar with the process said tens of thousands of experienced manufacturing engineers oversee the process. Tens of thousands of experienced manufacturing engineers. You just don't move to another country and suddenly find tens of thousands of experienced manufacturing engineers, or even people who are willing to seasonally come in and do little manual parts and all of that. This means that the entire process by which iPhones are created in China may not can't even be replicated in another country. You're not going to find this in the United States. You're not going to move this back with this process. You'll have to come up with another process. Well, guess what? Really complex industrial processes are not manufactured overnight. All right, listen, not the flu with increasing exclamation points here. We're still seeing this. Every day I'm reading about how the flu is worse. Let's just add up some of the data points here. China. If it was just the flu, China would not have shut down its entire economy. They just wouldn't have. If this was going to result in a few deaths, so what? The Fed doesn't do emergency rate cuts unless something really big is going on. There was never been an emergency rate cut because of the flu, right? The UAE is closing all its schools for at least 4 weeks. That's from today. Lots of places are closing schools and doing things which they would not normally or have never done in response to the flu. And, the South Korean president says the country's at war with the coronavirus. It's never said that about the flu. All right. Let's one quick thing. I want to talk about the mutating aspect of this virus. It's mutating quite a bit. None of these are actually critical mutations at this point. They're just very tiny little things. But I thought this was a great way to present it here. This comes from Roland Baker, who is at molecular genetics at UC Berkeley, and looking at 135 genome samples from SARS-CoV-II through yesterday. Dark orange and red represent the USA. And this shows infections in the USA belong to different branches of the tree. So this is a branch. Here was the original cases somewhere down here, and you can chase the direct lineage of all these different cases back to this early case, but then they diverged. And so this one came out here, and then it went this way, and then it had another mutation, and then this is shared out here, and then it comes out, and it comes out, and it comes out like this. So orange here, orange, red, all these are the US cases, right? So that just shows you that there's lots of different ways that this has come into the country and been changing and morphing as it goes. So this mutational aspect, though, I'm going to be looking into this more because, of course, this is the big fear that at some point you do get that critical mutation that actually makes it more lethal or something like that. So that's always a possibility. There's two different ways, and I'll go into this more when I actually cover this in a future update. But two different mutations you can have that we need a big, broad classes of them. One is a mutation that either makes this more transmissive or less. But in the scheme of things, the one that's more transmissive, that's going to get passed on preferentially because it transmits easier, right? So if there was a mutation in here, like let's pretend this one right here, if that mutation made this thing really, really hard to pass on, that's going to be the end of that lineage. Whereas if this one passes on super duper easy compared to any of the other ones, it's going to take over, and that would go on. So that's the first bucket. The second bucket is the mutation now going to make this more or less lethal? Now, if it's more transmissive and less lethal, that's great. If it's more transmissive and more lethal, say, that's bad. So we're going to talk about that and what the actual specific mutations might be that we would be keeping an eye out for. Remember, this is the nCoV, the novel coronavirus, or the SARS-CoV-II balancing act that every country is struggling with right now. You got to get the R0 below 1 if you want to stop the pandemic, but you got to keep your economy going, because if it totally crashes, the outcome from that could be actually worse than the virus itself. But you also need to keep the infection level below that, which swamps the hospitals. This is proving to be a surprisingly difficult concept for a lot of health officials to wrap their brains around and understand. It's pretty dead easy, I think, to understand, but it's proving to be, they're very resistant to that as an idea in many countries. Bizarre. I forgot to put into this checklist yesterday in yellow, because it was a new addition, which is that this coronavirus persists on some surfaces for up to 9 days. And that was things like plastic and steel and stuff like that. It was really quite persistent. So I just want to make sure that we put that on there, because that's different from the flu. The flu, generally known and generally speaking, only persists for a few hours on external surfaces. This thing is very different, very hardy, and survives. All right. Iran's case and death counts confirmed to be way too low. And we saw that with those really gruesome pictures from inside the morgue. There obviously the death counts are many orders higher than they've been saying. Maybe 2 orders of magnitude. We don't know. Quite a bit. But the fact that 10 of their MPs have come down with us tells me that Iran is really over the tips of their skis on this one. And so it's very dire what's going to happen there, I think. Countries without active testing programs, they're really just fooling themselves. The United States is in that camp, of course. And which means, my conclusion here is that anything that happens next, after that fooling of oneself, that falls under a self-inflicted wound category. So those are self-inflicted wounds. Hey, we didn't test, and we didn't find out about these things. Oh no, our hospital system's overwhelmed, and now we're seeing a lot more deaths than we should have because we crushed our hospital system, and now even ordinary treatable sorts of cases of pneumonia are succumbing. And as well, we're so swamped that ordinary other uses of our hospitals, which includes the usual heart attacks that happen in car accidents, and as well, births and cancer and all that other stuff that happens as a part of daily life. If your hospital system is crushed, all of those get treated poorly relatively as well. So if you don't test, you just fooled yourself, but just for a little while. It's my belief the United States, I think Italy's just a couple of weeks away from where China really broke into people's awareness, and they started having huge problems. South Korea as well. United States is just a couple of weeks behind those 2 cases. So case, cluster, boom. And oh no, who could have seen this coming? Well, all of us listening to this, of course. China's case numbers, they do not match their actions. So I always trust actions, not words, or in this case, the case reports. I think those are bogus still. It doesn't make any sense to me at all that China would be having basically 0 cases outside of Hubei, and yet still be, not traveling and not manufacturing and not doing all kinds of things. That's just out of China's character. That doesn't make any sense at all. The WHO, mind-bogglingly bad at their role, just terrible. I could have picked on them all day long, and what's the point? But I just wanted to, surface that a lot of people are still think the WHO has some relevance in getting data from them. I think they need to have a mutiny and get some people in there, because I know there's good people working at the WHO. I've met some, and they are there, but the leadership is mind-bogglingly bad at their role. So let me put it that way, please. The economic consequence of all this are just starting to penetrate equity markets that grew far too complacent, seem to have forgotten how to price risk. That means, the prices are just pretty high, and oh no, nothing bad will ever happen. And if anything bad happens, the Fed's got our back and they'll print us out of this. But the Fed can't print a supply chain, and the Fed can drop interest rates, but they're not going to make consumers change their behaviors and go back on holiday and break out their wallets for big purchases if they're worried, as they should be, rightly, about saving money, because who knows if they're even going to have a job in a week or two. And in the United States, also under self-inflicted wounds, has to fall the idea that in Taiwan, to contrast it, in Taiwan, they will pay for you to go and get tested if you think you need to be tested. And they make it financially easy for people to come down and get tested because they want the data. They want to know who's got this. In the United States, no such thing is going to happen around that. Nothing's been suggested around that, except I think in New York State, Governor Cuomo has talked about paying for tests, but generally speaking, the United States, it's not going to happen. So in the United States, why are consumers buckling down and suddenly saying, I'm going to defer and delay all sorts of purchases and economic activity? Because I don't know what's going to happen to me, my job, and all of that. So this is normal, right? And so, at any rate, huge risk hasn't been priced into the equity markets yet. And supply chain disruptions just now starting to really ripple through. Obviously, everybody knows about hand sanitizer, toilet paper, and face masks. Those have all experienced local and even national supply chain issues. But the big hits are coming, and those are to electronics and chemicals, and especially those chemicals related to pharmaceuticals in their precursors, which are shipped to India mainly. That's really worrisome. And again, this is most of the antibiotics, nearly all, except for maybe 3%, and most of the drugs out there that are, say, that people rely on that come from India. So that'd be a lot of your generics, and a lot of branded drugs as well come from India. But they get their precursors, by and large, from China. They're going to need to see China resuming their production very, very soon. But we're not seeing it. You know, those precursors are just, that would be creating a lot of this nitric oxide. All right. With that, I just want to remind everyone to remember to resubscribe if it's necessary, because people still are reporting getting unsubscribed. So I just want everybody to be aware of that. All right. As I lose my voice here at the end of the day, that's all I've got for today. Thank you for listening, and we'll be back with you tomorrow.
Hi folks, Adam Taggart here. Chris Martenson and I are the co-founders of Peak Prosperity. If you want to get alerted whenever we release a new video from Chris, just click the red subscribe button right beneath the YouTube video player. Once you've done that, a little bell icon will appear right next to it. Click on that bell. It looks like this. And that's it. The next time we publish a video from Chris, you'll immediately receive a notification from YouTube. Thanks for watching our videos.